I watched my wife sneak out to dinner with her lover. It wasn't just the pain of seeing her car turn the corner on that cold night, it was the confirmation my intuition had been screaming for months. This wasn't just a simple outing with friends, as she tried to claim when our eyes met at the restaurant. When I arrived at the table and she saw me, she was completely speechless. The wine glass almost slipped from her hand, and her voice came out in a trembling whisper, "It's just dinner with friends." I looked her in the eyes, directly, as if undressing a soul. "You don't have to lie to me. I already know everything." She paled as if the ground had dropped from beneath her feet. This was the woman with whom I'd shared my life, my plans, my story. And there, before me, was just a stranger with the taste of lies on her lips. I turned my back without scandal, without open anger. I left only an envelope on the table. Inside, the divorce letter I'd written in those late nights when she'd claimed to be too tired to talk, while her cell phone vibrated silently. She came home and found everything in its place, except me. Her closet empty of me. None of my clothes. No presents. Only absence. And absence has a weight that only those who have been left behind feel. She read that letter and her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. She fell asleep crying. And when she woke up and found me not by her side, she understood, she had lost me. Not only as a husband, but as a man, as a presence, as love. She didn't know it, but it was too late. I didn't want to be there anymore. Not after everything. I left without screaming, without breaking anything. What had been destroyed was gone. And it was in that silence of abandonment that the penny dropped. And what was supposed to be just a mistake became the biggest emotional catastrophe of her life. She tried to call me dozens of times in the days that followed. She looked for me at work, texted my friends, family, even my mother, a woman she'd avoided seeing for years. The messages changed tone with each attempt. First, denial. Then, desperation. Finally, pleading. "Please forgive me. I messed up, but I still love you. I didn't think about the consequences. I don't want to lose you." But love has a time. And when it's defeated by disappointment, no amount of pleading can revive it. I loved that woman with everything I had, but what she did to me wasn't just betraying my body, it was betraying who I was when I was with her. And that, not even time can heal. For weeks, she lived as if in mourning, a mourning without a wake, without a body, without a formal farewell. A mourning for what she lost and could never recreate. The house, once so full of presents, became an echo. The food lost its taste, the music lost its rhythm. The bed that had once been our shelter became the greatest punishment. She began to sleep beside her, as if I were still there, as if my absence could be replaced by memory. But memory doesn't warm, doesn't respond, doesn't forgive. And it was into this emptiness that she sank. He began revisiting our photos, our old notes, the videos of our travels. Everything that had once been a source of smiles now crushed her with the pain of what might have been. Then she decided to reach out to me. Not just call. She wanted to see me, talk to me. Tell me she understood, that she wanted to fix everything. But when she finally found me, when her eyes lit up at having me before her once more, it wasn't love she saw in my eyes. It was indifference. And the worst punishment for someone who betrayed true love is realizing they still feel everything, while the other person feels nothing. What she didn't expect was that I was no longer alone. That I had moved on with my life. That someone had appeared. A simple woman, with an honest smile, who saw in me what the other had forgotten to see. The love she had scorned now shone in another's eyes. And it wasn't revenge. It was the justice of time. The time that led me to someone who knew how to choose me. Because in the end, it wasn't betrayal that destroyed what we had. It was choice. She chose another man. I chose not to forgive. "Do you already have someone else?" she asked me, her voice breaking, as if she couldn't handle the answer already written in my silence. I simply said, yes. And you know what's different? She chose me, even with all my flaws. She didn't have to compare me to anyone else. From that moment on, she understood true repentance, not the kind that tries to undo a mistake, but the kind that realizes that the mistake took away everything that could have been. She left in tears. Alone. Empty-handed. And her heart crushed. There was no longer room for her in my world. And even if there had been, she wouldn't have known where to stand. Because the ground that supported us was shattered by her own hand. She still seeks me out today. She sends messages on special occasions, as if that could rekindle what she herself extinguished. She sends me handwritten letters, full of poetry and pain. She says she still dreams of me, that she still desires me. But I'm not the same anymore. Because betrayal transforms. It kills love, yes, but it also kills the man who trusted, who waited, who believed. I became someone else. Someone stronger, more attentive, and more distant. Her. She's still stuck in that dinner. In that guilty look. In that damned phrase, it's just dinner between friends. The betrayal wasn't just the breaking of a pact. It was the shattering of everything we'd built. And worst of all, it was proof that, no matter how much a heart loves, it can decide not to go back. Because true love also tires. And when it tires, it leaves without shouting. It just leaves the door ajar so the other person realizes they're alone. But what she'll never know is what I wrote in that divorce letter, in the final paragraph, before I signed it. What I put there, was what destroyed the last bit of hope that still lived in her. Because sometimes, a single sentence has the power to kill all chances of redemption. And it's about this phrase, and what it caused, that you still don't know. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and will never support any type of betrayal. All the stories told are fictional, but they reflect painful realities. The objective is only one: show how betrayal destroys lives, hearts and families. Get ready, because what you're about to hear is a story shocking, intense, and unforgettable. A good story. Jonathan and Emily were the kind of couple who, at first sight, made people believe in love. They met when they were young, during a photography class at a charming bookstore downtown, surrounded by old vinyl records and the smell of yellowed paper. He was introspective, possessed of an ironic humor and a sensitivity he hid beneath a restrained manner. She was energy in human form, spontaneous, with a light smile and a restless soul, with a way of seeing poetry in even the dullest routines. Emily came into Jonathan's life like a breeze in a long-locked room. And he, in turn, brought to her the kind of quiet, steady presence that made everything feel safe. The beginning was sweet, engaging, and full of small discoveries. They collected new coffees in unfamiliar corners of the city and had impromptu picnics on rainy days just to laugh at the idea of turning the unexpected into a moment. They were good together. Not in a cinematic way, but in a way that made sense in the details, in the comfortable silences, in the way they looked at each other when no one else was looking, in the plans for the future that seemed to grow like invisible roots. They built a simple but solid life. They lived in a single-story house with a porch and a huge bougainvillea that Emily insisted on pruning herself, even though Jonathan said she always made it even wilder. They had a bedroom painted aquamarine and paintings they'd taken themselves hung on the walls. Their routine was calm, almost predictable, with dinners cooked together, series starting but rarely ending, and plans always made together, like the idea of one day dropping everything for a year and traveling down roads they didn't even know the names of yet. He worked as an editor at a small literary magazine and spent hours immersed in texts that no one read properly but that kept him alive inside. She was a history teacher at a neighborhood school, known for her passionate conversations about the characters who shaped the world and for the letters she wrote to her students at the end of each school year. Their family was discreet. He came from a quiet home, where feelings were rarely exposed. He grew up learning that love was demonstrated through actions, not words. She, on the other hand, grew up in a noisy environment, full of kisses and loud laughter at the table, where love was synonymous with talking, touching, showing. Perhaps that's why they fit together so well, where one was lacking, the other filled in. They had been married for 8 years, and although the first few years had been a whirlwind of new experiences, the last 2 had settled into something more serene. It wasn't a lack of love, it was the weight of responsibilities, the weariness of everyday life, the struggle to keep the flame alive in a world that demands so much of everyone. Even so, there was tenderness between them. Jonathan still left notes hidden in her coat pocket on cold days, and Emily still ran her hand through his hair whenever he read before bed. They had a dog named Theo, a golden retriever who treated them like a son. On weekends, they would go for walks with him and talk about everything from politics to which plants to put in the garden. They also shared a long-standing passion for old movies and sometimes returned to a street cinema that showed classics in late-night screenings. One such day, as they watched Casablanca for the 4th time, Jonathan whispered that she was still his choice, even after all these years. She smiled, holding his hand tighter. Everything seemed to be fine. But silences began to grow in moments where there had previously been laughter. Conversations became shorter. Jonathan started coming home from work later, not because there was anything wrong, but because he felt he no longer knew how to start certain conversations. Emily, for her part, immersed herself in new courses, new reading material, new friendship circles, as if searching for something she couldn't yet name. They began going to bed at different times. He would fall asleep early. She would stay awake, reading or staring out the window as if waiting for something that wouldn't come. Even so, they maintained their rituals. They still celebrated anniversaries, still hugged after long days. There was still love. But the love was different. More restrained. More silent. A love that no longer burned, but still warmed. No one noticed. To the outside world, they remained that inspiring couple, that seemed firm, a partner. On social media, photos of trips, breakfasts in bed, declarations on special occasions. Inside, however, small voids were forming, tiny holes that no one notices until they became abysses. He blamed himself. He felt he should be more present, more attentive, more energetic. But he no longer knew how to be the man he'd been in the early years. She blamed herself too. Sometimes she looked at him and saw a stranger. Someone she knew by heart, but who no longer made her vibrate as before. And then came the prolonged silences. Absences justified with common excuses. The "I have a meeting" that became frequent, the "I'm going out with the people from work" that became routine. But nothing seemed alarming. Life went on, with commitments demanding presence, with maturity bringing other priorities. What no one imagined was that the heart, when not fed by real presence, begins to seek nourishment in the absences of others. The neighborhood admired them. They said they were made for each other. That the way they cared for each other seemed like something out of a soap opera. Friends commented on how lucky they were to still be together, while so many couples around them were breaking up. But luck, sometimes, is only appearance. And appearance doesn't sustain relationships. It sustains stories. And stories, when poorly told, become farces. Emily was more distracted. She spent more time outside, bringing new conversations to the table, mentioning names that hadn't previously been part of their vocabulary. Jonathan noticed, but didn't comment. Maybe out of fear. Maybe out of trust. Maybe because he didn't want to see what was already beginning to scream deep inside her. And she, in turn, looked at him tenderly, but with a kind of sadness in her eyes. Like someone in love, but not with the same completeness as before. Despite everything, there were moments when it seemed like everything was back to the way it was before. A sunny Sunday, a shared breakfast, a long hug at the end of a bad day. But these moments became rare. Like fragments of a book that, although still on the shelf, has had its pages ripped out without anyone noticing. At school, Emily was beloved by everyone. Her students adored her. Her co-workers saw her as a strong, inspiring woman, capable of transforming any situation into a learning experience. Jonathan, in turn, was seen as the stable, reliable man every woman dreams of having by her side. The kind who, when he loves, builds. When he believes, he gives. And when he gives, he sees it through. But the end, sometimes comes when you least expect it. The routine was the same. But the feelings were gone. The small, emotionally charged exchanges were replaced by polite smiles. The promises made in the past now seemed like distant memories of a time when everything was simpler. Emily continued to be admired by him. And he still respected her. But admiration and respect alone don't sustain a marriage. And neither of them knew how to rescue what seemed to have slipped through their fingers. They were in the middle. Not at the beginning, where everything is enchanted. Nor at the end, where everything is ruin. They were in the middle. Where it's worth deciding whether it's worth rebuilding, or letting it crumble for good. And while the house remained standing, the furniture in place, the plans still on paper, something had already begun to silently crumble. A kind of emotional erosion that no one sees, but which one day, inevitably, collapses. And what would come next, would forever change the course of their lives. Because love, when betrayed, doesn't scream. It falls silent. And in that silence lies the beginning of the end. That morning began like so many others, with the sound of the alarm breaking the silence and the light filtering through the curtains heralding another ordinary day. Jonathan got up first, as always, made the coffee, sorted the toast, and left the folded newspaper on the table. Emily appeared a few minutes later, still with messy hair and a sleepy look in her eyes, thanked him with a slight smile, and sat down in silence. They exchanged few words that morning, not for lack of intimacy, but because of a habit they had developed over time. The comfort of being present was enough. At least, that's what he believed. In the following days, the signs became more evident, though still too subtle for someone who loved with all their heart. Emily began to respond less, to smile more sparingly, to look out the window for seconds too long. Jonathan, although he noticed the growing distance, preferred to attribute it to routine, the fatigue of the week, the pressures of work, as if every emotional distance could be justified logically. One night, while rummaging through drawers for an old book, Jonathan found a small note in handwriting that wasn't his. There were no names, just one sentence: "Yesterday was unforgettable. I want more." His first reaction was inner silence, the kind of freeze that occurs when the mind refuses to understand. He reread it several times, as if a new reading might offer a different meaning. But there was no other. She sat on the edge of the bed with the note in her hands, her breathing irregular. Her heart pounded as if trying to anticipate a pain that still had no name. Emily was in the shower, and when she came out, she noticed his expression but didn't ask. She simply walked past him with a towel wrapped around her hair, kissed his forehead, and told him she was exhausted. Jonathan didn't mention the note that night. He kept it. Not out of cowardice, but because he still wanted to believe there was some logical explanation, some unlikely coincidence. He'd rather believe in a mistake than accept that the woman he loved so much was hiding a part of herself he didn't know. In the days that followed, doubt began to creep in. He looked at Emily with a mixture of affection and distrust, as if searching for a clue in her every gesture. He noticed the time she spent on her phone, the discreet smiles while typing, the sudden departures to meet friends, the subtle excuses for being out of the house at times that were previously theirs alone. Still, he remained silent. He wanted to see where this would lead. He wanted to observe, to be certain. He couldn't bear the thought of confronting her and hearing a lie in her eyes. Because if she lied while looking him in the eye, it would be impossible to continue there. So he waited. He watched. And her every gesture became more charged with meaning. Every absence, louder. One afternoon, when he arrived home early from work, he found the house silent. Theo, his puppy, was asleep on the couch. Emily had gone out without warning. A rare occurrence. Jonathan decided not to call. He just waited. When she returned, she was wearing a dress he'd never seen before and wearing a different perfume. She said she'd gone to an exhibition with a friend, and they ended up having wine afterward. He just nodded. He knew it was a lie. But it wasn't time to say anything yet. He memorized every detail like someone painfully assembling a 1,000-piece puzzle. Jonathan began following her. One afternoon a week, he'd say he had a meeting out of town, but in reality, he'd park his car a few blocks from the school where she worked. He waited. He watched. And it was on one of those afternoons that he saw her. Emily was leaving through the side gate, accompanied by a man he'd never seen before. They walked side by side, laughing with a disconcerting intimacy. She touched his arm as she spoke, and he looked at her with a desire impossible to ignore. Jonathan didn't know the man's name, nor his story, but he knew he'd entered where he used to belong. He didn't follow them that afternoon. He went home, locked himself in the bathroom, and cried silently, like he hadn't done in a long time. The pain was strange, not explosive. It was a kind of pain that spread slowly, that took over the body gradually, that made his chest feel heavy as a stone. He began to question everything. When had it started? Why hadn't he noticed before? What had he done or failed to do? He tried to remember the last time they had truly looked at each other. He began to doubt even the good memories. Had she at some point stopped wanting something else? Or had it all always been false? Jonathan decided to wait once more. He needed proof. Something that would leave no room for doubt. The following week, realizing she'd overdressed for dinner with school friends, he left a few minutes later. He followed her. From a distance, but with precision. He watched her park at a discreet restaurant in a remote neighborhood. He watched the same man appear minutes later. They walked in together, hand in hand. There was no fear. There was no fear of being seen. They were at ease, like two lovers who met often. Jonathan remained in the car, staring at the facade with an expression that mixed despair and resignation. He didn't get in right away. He needed to breathe. He needed to be sure he wouldn't explode in front of everyone. After half an hour, he got up, crossed the street, and entered the restaurant. The room was full. The ambient music drowned out the sound of silverware. He found them at the back, at a more private table. She was laughing. She was beautiful. There was a sparkle in her eyes he hadn't seen in a long time. When her eyes met his, they froze. She went pale. The man next to her looked confused. Jonathan approached, firmly, without raising his voice. He simply looked into her eyes and said calmly, almost tenderly, "You don't have to lie to me. I already know everything." The silence that fell at the table seemed to weigh a ton. Emily tried to mumble something, but the words wouldn't come. The man, not quite understanding, placed his hand over hers, as if it could protect her. Jonathan just smiled. A sad, tired smile. He took a white envelope from his pocket and placed it on the table. Inside was the signed divorce decree. He said nothing else. He simply turned and left. Unhurriedly. Without despair. Because what really hurt, had already hurt for too long. Emily didn't follow him. She stood there, motionless, staring at the envelope as if it were a sentence. The man beside her asked if she was okay, but she didn't answer. Her mind was elsewhere. On the note Jonathan left on her pillow, on lazy Sunday breakfasts, on his laughter watching old movies, on the calm of shared silences. Only there, at that table, did she understand what she had lost. He wasn't just a husband. He was the love of her life. And by trading that for a few moments of novelty, she had, without realizing it, signed the end of everything. What she didn't yet know was that dinner was just the tip of the iceberg. There was more. A detail she could never have foreseen. A hidden truth, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And that truth would change everything. The week after dinner was filled with dense silence, held breaths, and racing thoughts. Emily tried to understand how Jonathan had found out, trying to reconstruct his steps, his words, his glances, as if that could change what had already been done. She couldn't sleep, didn't eat, and barely responded to messages. He walked around the house like a ghost, touching the furniture as if searching for a presence that was no longer there. Inside, a dry emptiness grew, the kind of pain only those who realized someone's worth too late can feel. Jonathan, on the other hand, didn't respond to any of her attempts at contact. He changed his routine, even changed the way he breathed. That searing pain had transformed into a firm decision. There was no more room for doubt, or for compromise. It was time to leave behind what had hurt him. But inside Emily, something was beginning to crumble even more deeply. She wasn't just dealing with the regret of betrayal, but with the breaking of something greater, a connection she swore would be eternal, even in the quietest moments. And the most painful thing was seeing that, despite everything, he had managed to move forward. Days later, she decided to look for him. Not by text, not by phone. She needed to see him. Look him in the eye, even if it was just to get one last negative, but she needed to face reality. She knew where he usually went on Saturday mornings, a small, hidden cafe where he used to write while drinking black coffee without sugar. Emily arrived early, waited across the street. When he appeared, alone, with a serene expression she no longer recognized, her heart sank. He looked fine. He looked, at peace. As she crossed the street and approached the door, her stomach churned. She walked in, and when he saw her, his eyes simply followed her with calculated coldness. There was no anger. There was no surprise. There was a wall between them. She sat down uninvited, took a deep breath, and for a few seconds simply observed him. He was different. More assertive. Less vulnerable. As if he had freed himself from something consuming him. She began by saying she hadn't come to ask for forgiveness because she knew no forgiveness would change the facts. But she needed to say she was sorry, that she now understood the gravity of what she had done. Jonathan listened silently, only nodding. When she said she couldn't live with the guilt, that she couldn't sleep, that life had lost its color, he simply replied, his voice low, "I loved you. I really did. But you didn't choose me." Emily began to cry, but it wasn't a cry begging for mercy. It was the cry of someone standing in front of a mirror and seeing, for the first time, who they've become. She said it all started out of need, a moment of emptiness she couldn't name. She said she thought she could live both ways, keep the marriage and try something new without anyone getting hurt. But now she saw she had destroyed not only the marriage, but something bigger. Jonathan didn't respond immediately. He drank the last sip of his coffee, looked out the window, and then, calmly, dropped the sentence that would change everything, "You know what you never knew? He was married. And his wife, was my ex-girlfriend." Emily froze, her mind trying to comprehend what had been said. Jonathan continued, without changing his tone, "I recognized them the first time I saw them together. The irony is, she left me years ago. And now, he was with you. It's a small world, isn't it?" Emily tried to mumble something, but Jonathan held up his hand, signaling silence. "I could have told her everything. I could have screamed. But I chose to watch in silence. Because I knew that, sooner or later, the price would come. Fate exacts its toll. And it exacts its toll with interest." Her breath hitched. Her face was shocked, her eyes wide. "You knew since when?" Her voice came out in a whisper. Jonathan replied, "Since the second date. I saw them both going into the same hotel where she and I used to go. The same one. She knew it was my favorite place. Maybe it was on purpose. Maybe not. But that's when I realized I didn't have to do anything. I just had to wait." Emily was devastated. She remembered the meetings, the dinners, the conversations. She began to see each moment in a new light. Had she been used? Manipulated? But Jonathan's gaze held no cruelty. It held liberation. I didn't do anything, Emily. I just withdrew. And in withdrawing, you revealed yourselves. You didn't lose me. You lost yourself. She put her hands to her face, tears streaming uncontrollably. He didn't tell me he was married. I didn't know. The sentence held no power. It sounded like an empty excuse. Jonathan stood, grabbed his coat, and turned to leave. But before he left, he looked at her one last time. Now you understand. Revenge isn't always necessary. Sometimes letting go is punishment enough. Emily stood there for minutes, maybe hours. She didn't know. The cafe filled up, then emptied. And she remained in the same position, her face in her hands, her heart shattered by a revelation that hurt her in places she hadn't even known existed. Because the worst part wasn't being left. It was discovering she'd been just another piece in a puzzle of intertwined mistakes. A repetition of cycles. A consequence of poor choices. Her lover disappeared from her life days later. He vanished without explanation. He simply stopped responding. She blocked his number. She disappeared from social media. As if she were a shadow he wanted to forget. Jonathan, meanwhile, reappeared in a photo with another woman. A woman with sweet eyes and a bright smile. It wasn't his ex. It was someone new. Someone who made him truly laugh, like he hadn't in a long time. Emily saw that photo alone at home, with an untouched cup of tea and her eyes still red from crying. He read the caption more than 10 times, with someone who knows what it's like to love and choose every day. Her world crumbled. Not out of revenge. Not out of anger. But out of the silent force of truth. The truth she tried to ignore. The truth that now screamed within her. She traded a home for a shortcut. A love for an impulse. And when she realized it, it was too late. Because time doesn't come back. And what breaks inside, sometimes, can't be mended. That afternoon in the coffee shop had become a turning point. Emily, left there with her pain exposed and her pride shattered, walked the streets as if she no longer knew where to go. Cars passed, faces crossed, but she was numb, as if the city had lost its sound. When she arrived home, the house she had once shared with Jonathan, everything seemed out of place, even though everything was exactly where it should be. His scent still lingered in the air, mixed with the lavender perfume she always used to spray on her pillows before bed. But now, the aroma seemed to mock his absence, like a cruel reminder of what was and is no longer. In the days that followed, Emily tried to maintain some sort of routine. She went to work, taught classes with a blank stare, laughed mechanically at her students' jokes, smiled with her colleagues as if trying to convince herself she was okay. But the truth was that inside, something had broken irreversibly. And more than the regret of the betrayal, what devastated her was the feeling of having been replaced. Because it's one thing to lose someone, it's another to see them happy without you. Jonathan, meanwhile, was breathing new air. After years of being suffocated by silence, he now allowed himself to walk lightly. He began traveling more frequently, visiting old friends, reconnecting with distant family. And slowly, effortlessly, he met Laura. A sweet, simple woman with a listening gaze. She didn't ask difficult questions, but always gave answers that touched where he didn't even know it hurt. With Laura, he relearned to laugh fearlessly, to tell stories without fear of judgment, to exist without feeling the need to prove anything. It was different. It wasn't an explosive passion, but a delicate construction, brick by brick, made of sincere conversations, unhurried walks, and welcoming silences. Emily found out about Laura through a photo. A mutual friend had shown it, without malice, but without filtering the impact. When she saw Jonathan smile beside that woman, something inside her collapsed completely. He was happy. And worse, he was happy without her. The pain didn't come as a punch, but as a constant pressure in his chest, as if the world had become too small to contain his anguish. Days later, on an impulse she couldn't even explain, Emily went to the old house. She needed to see it for herself, needed to feel that it was all real. She knew Jonathan still went there sometimes to pick up items or sort out divorce paperwork. And she waited. When he arrived, alone, with a quiet step and a calm expression, she got up from the porch bench and called out to him. He stopped, surprised to see her, but showed no hostility. He simply said he hadn't expected that. She asked to talk, and he, out of politeness or perhaps curiosity, accepted. They sat in the living room, as they had so often before. But now there was a chasm between them. Emily began by saying she knew he no longer owed her anything, but she needed to talk. And then she spilled everything. She said she'd regretted it the moment she saw him leaving the restaurant. That she'd spent nights trying to understand how she'd let herself be carried away by something so shallow. That she thought about him every day. Jonathan listened to her, motionless, but with his gaze fixed, attentive. When she mentioned Lara, his voice faltered. He simply replied that life goes on, and that he couldn't wait for someone who had left him waiting alone for so long. But Emily insisted. She said she still loved him. That she knew he had changed, but that within her there was still room for rebuilding. Jonathan took a deep breath, ran his hand over his face, and replied firmly but without aggression, "You don't love me. You love who I was to you. But I'm not that man anymore. And you're not that woman anymore. We've lost each other. And maybe the pain is accepting that there's no going back." Emily wept silently, without making a fuss. It was a resigned cry, as if she knew she was losing him once again. But this time, she was fully aware that it was all her fault. Jonathan got up and went to the closet to get a box. He handed it to her. It was what remained of the life they shared, letters, photographs, small objects. She opened it right there, without asking permission. She took out a letter in her old handwriting, one she had written in the first months of their relationship. Rereading the words, she felt a lump in her throat. It was a note about promises, about the future, about being a home for each other. But now it all sounded like an echo of a past that no longer fit in the present. Jonathan observed it for a few seconds, then said, "Keep this. Not as a punishment, but as a reminder of what we were. Not every love needs to last to be true. But when you choose to destroy, you can't expect to rebuild with the same pieces." She looked into his eyes, still hoping for a glimmer of compassion, a glimmer of hope. But what she found was only acceptance. He had already turned the page. Not with resentment, but with maturity. Emily stood, holding the box, and before leaving, she turned one last time. "If I ever get married again, I'll still feel that you were the love of my life." Jonathan replied with a slight, almost sad smile, "And maybe that's why we didn't work out." That night, Emily returned home and placed the box on her bed. She spent hours looking at each item, each memory. She finally understood that the betrayal hadn't just destroyed her marriage. It had destroyed a better version of her. The woman she was with Jonathan was more whole, lighter. And in losing him, she had lost herself. Jonathan, for his part, was having dinner with Lara at that very moment. They laughed about something trivial, shared cheap wine, and talked about old movies. But there was something precious, peace. He didn't mention the past. He didn't carry any resentment. He carried only the lessons learned from someone who knew how to let go. And knew how to recognize a new beginning when it appeared. In the days that followed, Emily began a solitary process of rebuilding. Not for him, but for you. She started therapy, started writing again, took a trip alone. But nothing filled that specific void. Because there are spaces within us that only a specific person can fill. And when that person leaves, the space is still there, like an internal scar. Time passed, and each went their own way. But for Emily, all paths always led to the same destination, the memory of him. Of what they were. Of what could have been. And of what, through a wrong choice, she had lost forever. The night wore on, and the house seemed even emptier than before, as if every object inside had become aware of Jonathan's irreversible absence. Emily, sitting on the living room floor, knees drawn to her chest, eyes lost in the shadows cast by the streetlights, allowed herself to be consumed by a silence that didn't welcome her, only crushed her. She no longer cried as she had in the early days. Now there was a bitter stillness, a kind of pain that no longer needed to be expressed in tears because it had become part of her body, ingrained in every muscle, in every thought. It was like carrying an invisible weight that accompanied her even in the most mundane tasks, like brushing her teeth, making coffee, or putting on her shoes. Jonathan was no longer there, not in his scent, not in his presence, not in his things. His absence was no longer a painful emptiness, it was tender, like time, like the wind, like the seasons that pass even without our permission. In the days following that last conversation, Emily tried to maintain a dignity that no longer belonged to her. She stopped looking for Jonathan, though she thought of him on every corner, in every sound of the city, in every smell that reminded her of lazy Sundays spent with him. She tried not to check his social media anymore, but sometimes she slipped up, saw photos of him with Lara, and felt a kind of silent envy she couldn't bring herself to name. It wasn't envy of the woman, it was envy of the new version of him, the one she knew existed because she herself helped build it, but which now no longer belonged to her. His world moved on, with simplicity, with dignity, with peace. Hers dragged on, trapped in a time that no longer existed, frozen in the last night they slept side by side, unaware it was their last. She began to notice how people looked at her differently, how her colleagues at work avoided talking about relationships, how the couple's friends had naturally flocked to Jonathan's side, not by explicit choice, but because he was the one who maintained coherence, calm, and poise. He was the one who didn't need to justify anything. She, on the other hand, carried the weight of all the questions no one asked, but everyone thought. Little by little, she began to frequent new places, where no one knew her, where she wasn't Jonathan's ex or the one who cheated. She tried to find herself among strangers, but even there, in anonymity, guilt followed her like a shadow. It wasn't a guilt that begged forgiveness, it was a guilt that demanded transformation, that forced her to look at herself with brutal honesty and accept that she was no longer the woman she once was, and perhaps never would be again. Jonathan, for his part, felt a lightness he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't a vengeful relief, not the satisfaction of someone who had overcome something, but the serenity of someone who had chosen to no longer carry what had hurt him. He and Lara didn't talk about the past, it was a tacit agreement. What existed between them was new, and therefore needed to be nurtured with silence and truth. She didn't ask about Emily, and he didn't feel like talking. When some remnant surfaced in his memories, he simply acknowledged it and let it pass. There was no bitterness, only a kind of quiet gratitude for what he had experienced and a calm relief that he was no longer in that place. One weekend, Jonathan received an invitation to a photography exhibition organized by a former college classmate. He hesitated for a moment before confirming his attendance, but Lara encouraged him, saying that sometimes you need to revisit certain places to be certain they no longer belong to you. He went. And as he walked among the photos, he felt a gentle longing for the person he once was, the one he dreamed of innocently, but he didn't miss Emily. He missed himself, that version of him she had known, but who now existed in a different form, more mature, less needy for acceptance. Meanwhile, Emily, sitting in a random cafe, received a call from Jonathan's mother. They hadn't spoken in months, but the connection came as a jolt of reality. The woman simply said she missed her, that she considered her like a daughter, but that she no longer knew how to maintain that bond without betraying her own son. It was one of the cruelest moments Emily had ever experienced. Not because the woman had been harsh, but because she spoke the truth gently. Betrayal hadn't just hurt Jonathan. It had undone an entire network of affection that now lay crumbling. That same night, Emily began writing. She grabbed an old notebook and decided to tell herself the story of what she'd experienced. Not as a way of seeking redemption, but as an attempt to understand. She wrote everything down. The pain, the wrong choices, the emptiness she couldn't name, the moment she realized she'd crossed a line of no return. And when she finished, she felt physically exhausted. As if writing had been a surgery without anesthesia. But she also felt something she hadn't expected, peace. A bitter, imperfect peace, but one that, somehow, restored a bit of her own humanity. Rereading what she'd written, she understood that her story with Jonathan wasn't a mistake. It was a love that existed, but that didn't survive the shortcomings. And that, despite the ending, it had been true while it lasted. The following month, she saw him by chance. They were in a bookstore, he alone, leafing through a book of poetry, as he often did. She couldn't help but lean in closer, and their eyes met. There was no tension. There was no smile. Just a discreet nod, as if recognizing someone who had been an important part of their journey. She simply said, "Hi." And he replied, "Hi." She asked how he was, and he replied sincerely, "I'm fine." She nodded, her eyes welling, and said, "I'm happy for you." And he thanked her. There were no promises, no regrets thrown into the air. Just two people who had once loved each other deeply, and who now knew that love, when mistreated, does not die, but transforms into a memory. On the way home, Emily didn't cry. Not this time. She felt something had come to an end. Not just with him, but within her. A door closed gently, without a bang. Jonathan, for his part, arrived home, found Lara reading on the porch, sat beside her, and rested his head on her shoulder. She didn't ask anything, just intertwined her fingers with his. And there, in silence, he knew he no longer needed to understand the past. Just live in the present. In the following months, Emily dedicated herself to a social project, returned to school, and began giving lectures on empathy and emotional reconstruction. She spoke of choices, love, and consequences. She never mentioned names, never assigned blame. She simply told stories, her own, with the honesty of someone who knows that loving is easy, but maintaining love requires courage. And that the greatest courage is not betraying what you promised someone, but, above all, not betraying yourself. Autumn progressed like a precise metaphor for what Emily carried inside, dry leaves falling one by one, a reminder of the inevitable end of a cycle. She had transformed into someone who observed more than she spoke, who analyzed silences and small gestures with the intensity of someone who had come to understand the value of presence and the weight of absence. The days had become a sequence of slow reconstructions, not just external but internal. It was difficult to explain to people that the pain no longer came from the loss of the relationship, but rather from the brutal realization that she had destroyed something precious with her own hands. Emily began attending literary gatherings, not to escape herself, but because in books she found versions of her own dilemmas. One day, at one of these gatherings, after reciting a text about loss she had written, a white-haired woman approached, took her hand, and said, "You write as if you've experienced a love you couldn't keep." Emily just smiled, her eyes welling up. Because there lay the harshest, simplest truth. Jonathan continued with his routine. His relationship with Lara blossomed naturally, unhurriedly, without demands. There was a serene complicity between them, the kind that doesn't require grandiose declarations, just a genuine presence. One Sunday afternoon, while walking through an antiques fair, he found an old camera similar to the one Emily had given him on their first anniversary. He remained silent for a few seconds, holding the object in his hands, remembering a time that no longer hurt him, but still existed somewhere. Lara realized the weight of that moment, and without asking, intertwined her fingers with his. Jonathan smiled, placed the camera back on the table, and said, "Some memories are beautiful, but they don't need to become relics." And they continued on, like two travelers aware that the past is part of the journey, but not the destination. Emily, despite overcoming the pain, still faced echoes of what she'd experienced. One cloudy morning, she was called for an interview on a local radio station. The topic was overcoming obstacles and difficult choices. She hesitated before accepting, but eventually went. During the interview, when asked about her biggest regret, she didn't mention names, simply saying that she once had everything she'd ever dreamed of: affection, complicity, respect, and traded it for a fleeting emotion, for something that seemed more vibrant but was hollow inside. She said it took complete loss to understand what she truly had. The host, visibly touched, remained silent for a few seconds before continuing the show. As she was leaving, a young woman approached with teary eyes and thanked her for her courage. She said she was about to make a similar mistake, but now she clearly saw the consequences. Emily hugged the young woman tightly. Perhaps that hug was also for herself. Time passed, as it always does, indifferent to people's feelings. Jonathan and Lara were invited to the wedding of a mutual friend. It was a small, intimate event. He accepted. When they arrived, they were smiling and elegant. They were warmly welcomed. But as they entered the hall, Jonathan saw her. Emily was there, sitting at one of the back tables, invited by the ties he still had with the bride. For a second, his gaze wavered. Lara noticed but said nothing. Emily stood to greet the bride and groom, and as she passed them, the inevitable happened. Their eyes met. This time, there was no pain, no hurt. Just the silent respect of someone who knows the other was an essential part of a story that shaped who they are. She smiled gently and walked on. Jonathan, for the first time, didn't feel the need to shy away from that gaze. It was as if, finally, they both understood they were where they needed to be. Later, during the party, as the music filled the room with a danceable lightness, Emily approached Jonathan in the outdoor garden, where he was watching the sky. She excused herself, and he nodded. They sat in silence for a few moments. Then she said bluntly, "You look fine. And I'm genuinely happy about that." Jonathan thanked her, looking at the horizon. Then he added, "And you look at peace. And I'm happy about that, too." She took a deep breath, looked at him sincerely, and said, "You know, I spent a lot of time trying to understand why I did what I did. I thought I needed to experience something different, something that would break me out of my routine. But today I see that the problem wasn't love. It was me. I was losing myself, and I thought the problem was you. When, in fact, you were the only thing keeping me going." Jonathan didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded slightly, as if he understood without having to agree. Then he said, "We all have moments when we go astray. But what matters is what we do after we realize it. And looking at you now, I see that you understand. That's enough." Emily smiled, but it was a sad smile. She knew there was no more space between them. But there was something greater than any reconciliation, there was respect. And that, in the end, was the only redemption possible. When she returned to her desk, she found a message on her phone. It was from an editor at a small publishing house who had read her writing and wanted to publish it. Emily read the message with teary eyes. It was as if life was telling her that, although she had lost a love, she had gained a new voice. A new chance. A way to transform her pain into something useful, into something that would touch other lives. And this, for her, was the beginning of something she couldn't yet name, but which she sensed would be liberating. Jonathan returned to Lara. Noticing his return, she simply held his hand firmly. He looked at her, smiled, and said, "She's fine." Lara replied, "And you?" Jonathan squeezed her hand and said, for the first time in a long time, "Yes." They embraced and returned to the ballroom, where life danced in the form of music and soft lights. Emily watched them for a moment. Then she looked away, opened a notebook she always carried in her bag, and began to write. Because now, more than ever, she knew the value of words. She knew that stories have power. The power to heal, to warn, to remember. And hers, though marked by profound pain, could serve to prevent others from repeating the same steps. Another season passed. Emily launched her first book at a small, intimate event. During her speech, she said, "Sometimes life teaches us the hard way. But it does. And if you listen to the silence between one pain and the next, you can discover who you truly are. At the end of the event, she received a standing ovation. Among the guests, a familiar figure watched in silence, with restrained pride, Jonathan's mother. After the audience dispersed, she approached, hugged her, and said, "You've learned. And that is already a lot." Emily couldn't hold back her tears. She felt that, somehow, she had been forgiven for a part of her past. And that, symbolic as it was, carried enormous weight. Night fell, and she walked alone through the streets that now seemed more welcoming. Not because the pain had gone away, but because she had found a greater purpose. And as the light wind touched her face, she thought that not all loves are eternal, but some teach lessons that last a lifetime. And with that, she could live. Not with Jonathan by her side, but with the certainty that she had once truly loved, and that now, finally, she was learning to love herself. Years had passed since their last words, and life, with its discreet and relentless way of moving forward, had already changed the landscape, the routines, the faces around them. Emily was no longer the woman who once desperately sought to recover what she had destroyed, just as Jonathan no longer carried on his shoulders the weight of a disappointment that had long shaped his days. They were now fragments of each other, echoes that sometimes surfaced in confused dreams or unexpected memories, but which no longer dictated her choices. Emily became a respected author, her words piercing hearts with the rawness of truth and the delicacy of vulnerability. Each text she wrote was, in essence, a veiled apology, not only to Jonathan, but to all the versions of herself she had let die in the process. The woman who once desired to be loved above all else now knew that the hardest love to win is her own. In one of her lectures, she was asked how she deals with the pain she caused, and she responded with firm eyes and a choked voice, transforming guilt into service, and regret into conscience so that no one needs to learn the hard way like I did. Jonathan had married Lara in a simple yet meaningful ceremony. There were no exaggerations, no empty promises. There was an exchange of glances that knew what they carried, a genuine respect for the pain each carried in their hearts. Their relationship was based on small shared truths, respected spaces, and embraced silences. Lara never asked him to forget what he'd experienced, only to allow him to live again. And Jonathan, little by little, realized that true love doesn't require us to erase the past, but to know how to integrate it so that it doesn't paralyze us. When their first child was born, Jonathan cried like he hadn't cried in years. It was as if, in that cry, he was washing away all the old pain and making room for a new life, a story he never imagined he would write so simply and so fully. Fatherhood changed him, deepened his way of loving, and connected him with the most genuine part of himself, the one that Emily, in some way, also helped awaken. One afternoon, in a bookstore, while signing her new book, Emily noticed an envelope discreetly left by one of the people in line. There was no return address, just her name written in a handwriting she would never forget. He opened it with trembling hands. It was a letter. Jonathan said he had heard about the new book, that he had read it in silence, and that, for the first time, he felt she had forgiven herself. He said he now understood that some losses are necessary for us to become who we need to be, and that, although they had gone their separate ways, he cherished everything they had experienced. Emily read that letter dozens of times. She cried, smiled, and felt a peace she never thought she would find. She never responded. She didn't need to. The letter was an elegant, respectful finale, sealing an intense story with the only thing that remained, gratitude. A few months later, Emily was invited to speak at an international conference. It was her greatest achievement. At the airport, between departures and farewells, she saw a family walking from afar, Jonathan, Lara, and the little boy she carried on her shoulders. They didn't see her. She stopped, watched with a calm heart, and smiled. There he was, whole. And there she was, whole too, albeit in a different form. It was the unspoken closing of a cycle. A silent and definitive goodbye. She turned, boarded, and, as the plane rose among the clouds, felt for the first time that she had truly freed herself from everything. This story is a stark portrait of how choices shape destinies. Emily didn't lose Jonathan the moment he walked out the door, but the moment she chose to turn her back on what was true. Jonathan didn't take revenge, didn't scream, didn't destroy himself, he simply moved on, and that was the most impactful thing of all. Because sometimes, the greatest punishment is seeing someone flourish where you chose to destroy them. Lara, in turn, is the representation of healthy love, a love that embraces without needing to erase the other's past, that understands that loving also means accepting scars. Now we want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Leave a comment and share your opinion. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now to continue receiving intense, real stories with profound lessons about the choices we make and the cost they inflict. This story sends a clear message: betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships, it disfigures the purest thing between two people, trust. And once broken, love can't always mend the pieces. So think before hurting someone who loves you. One mistake can cost you the most precious thing, the person who would be by your side until the end. And remember, this channel does not condone any kind of betrayal. Here, we tell stories to show that love, when well cared for, is the only path truly worth taking.